Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mysteries of life. This episode is a complement to our upcoming retreat at Hollyhock Lifelong Learning Center on the territory of the Klahoose, Tla'amin, and Hamalko First Nations, commonly known as Cortes Island, BC. More on that at the end of the show. My guest today is my dear, sweet friend, author and consultant, Monique Gary Smith. And today we're talking about territorial acknowledgements. What are they and why do we do them? As part of my commitment a few years ago to incorporating acts of reconciliation into my personal and professional life, I began inviting elders of all ages to open all of my retreats and workshops with a territorial acknowledgement. And whenever I was invited to give a speech or lead a networking event or any circle of any kind, I would verbally acknowledge the original inhabitants of the territory myself. The only way I figured out how to do this in a more or less really, good way, the best way I could, was through the grace of Monique Gary Smith being patient and kind with me and gently directing and redirecting. I've wanted to host this conversation for a long time so that if you are ever in a position to introduce yourself to an audience or welcome people to an event that you have convened, and you too would like to commit to this very small act of reconciliation and acknowledgement, you can feel a bit more confident with Monique offering insight to you too. We connected at my home on the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. So Monique, what identities do you lead with?
I would say I lead first with mom, being a mom, and then a daughter, and a sister, and a wife. Those would be the ones I would lead most with. And I think about, that I feel like I stand sort of on a bridge, that I am the descendant of my ancestors. So I'm that being the daughter, because my grandparents have all passed, and being the ancestor to my descendants. So my children, and then the grandchildren who have yet to come. And I think in that place, then it's like the responsibilities I walk in the world with are... I think about that a lot, about how will my children talk about me when I've passed over to the other side? And what do I want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know? Like, what is that legacy? And so I think when you ask that question, it's quite big for me about more than in this moment. Who am I and what identities do I lead with? But also, what are the legacies that ripple from those identities, for sure. And then I guess in the Western construct, I would also say that I'm an author, a storyteller, a speaker.
All the titles.
I guess all the titles, yeah.
All those things. Well, I'm really excited that you agreed to have this conversation. You and I have talked lots about reconciliation, and you have been a very gentle guide and advisor at times with me, of calling me in on some things that you sometimes have had to repeat more than once, which I very much appreciate. And I consider the weaving in of territorial acknowledgements as part of my work in reconciliation as a fifth-generation settler of Scottish descent. And so let's talk about territorial acknowledgements. It's something that I would say maybe since 2010 Olympics has been in the public and sort of an atmospheric part of living on the West Coast. If you ever go to a public event, any civic event, it's often, you could go to City Hall in Victoria, and every speaker who works in government will probably acknowledge that we live and work and play on the land of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. So in this tiny little postage stamp part of Canada, it's very common. But I think it's only just starting to be exported to other parts of the country. And certainly when I've gone to public events, conferences, and things like that in the U.S. There's been no acknowledgement of whose traditional territories we might be on. So this is a big new learning curve for a lot of listeners. Would you please just define and describe what is a territorial acknowledgement, and what's the difference between an acknowledgement and a territorial welcome?
Because they're quite distinct. For me, they are. And other people have their own personal guideposts around those two differences. But for me, an acknowledgement, and we do have, I think you're right, that in this area where we live, it is very common to hear it. And for me, that there's a beauty within that, but there's also a deprivation within that, because in some places it's now become a tick mark. Oh yes, okay, acknowledge the territory, tick, done, I did that, okay. Instead of it being, let me pause for a moment and really think about, what am I grateful for about living on this land that was and is of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. And that's so different than just, I'm grateful to live on. Because then it's like, okay, I'm grateful to raise my children here. I'm grateful to be able to be creative here. I'm grateful to be able to walk in the woods and have that medicine. I'm grateful to be able to sit at the ocean. Whatever it is for individuals, that makes it so different than the tick mark. Mm-hmm. And, it's so interesting you asked this question now, because just last weekend I married my wife's cousin and her now husband. Mm. And in that intro, I talked about acknowledging the territory that we were on. And I was saying, for some of you living in other parts of Canada who have come here to celebrate these two, and for those of you from around the world who have come, you may not understand what it is that I'm doing. So this is why we do this. Mm. This is why we honor the Wasanic people, and specifically this area, they're the saltwater people, and this is why, because of the peninsula. So some of that explanation around what is the beauty of the privilege of where we live. And that's, I think, the acknowledgement. It's like, because when I can own, what am I actually acknowledging about the gift of being present on this land, is different than, the tick that happens that we hear, right? You're exactly right. Mm-hmm. If you go somewhere, you'll hear almost every single speaker acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. Whereas a welcome is usually done by somebody who's from the land that we're visiting on. And if somebody from the land can't do that, then usually a family member will ask somebody else to do it. So in the past, you've seen me do acknowledgements, especially at the Victoria Yoga Conference. And I don't do a welcome because it's not my place to welcome. That's
because you're not a member of the nations that make
I'm not a member from these nations, and I am a visitor to these lands. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you say which
nation you come from? My mom comes from Papikassis First Nation, which is in the Qu'Appelle Valley of Saskatchewan, from the Cardinal and Lenape families. And my dad is Scottish and Lakota from Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
I wonder what it would be like in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, if you went and, were traveling through there as a writer or something and said, "Hi, I'm Monique Gary Smith, and I want to acknowledge the land of," I can't remember the first time I heard a territorial acknowledgement. It's been so long. But do you have that experience when you're traveling as a writer where you acknowledge where you're from and people's faces, something happens because it's the first time they've heard that?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even sometimes here, which surprises me, but even sometimes here. And I don't always know if it's because of that it isn't just said in a tick box way, right, or if people have never heard it before. And, we had Pride in the Word as part of our Pride celebrations at the beginning of July. And the host of that, his name is Billy Nickerson, and he's a poet, and he teaches creative writing. And he did one of the most beautiful territorial acknowledgements. I had tears running down my face because I've never heard an acknowledgement like that before. And I was like, wow. He had done some research about the land, about the history, And he told a couple stories about his experience being on this land and what it meant to him. And I was like, that shifts the acknowledgement to a very personal connection. And really, that's what it's supposed to be about, right? It's about how does my heart and mind connect with this land that I'm blessed to be a visitor on.
Do you remember last fall, you were at my intuitive business planning workshop, and I invited Tiffany Chouette Joseph to provide the Territorial Acknowledgement, and she is a member of Wasanich Nations, and so she basically, in the language, Senchathan, was like, I acknowledge the willow, I acknowledge the wind, I acknowledge the soil, I acknowledge this, and she did it in a different language. I had tears. It was, this is the month of the 5 great winds in our tradition, and it was so windy that day. I was just like, oh my God, this is like the richness of encounter with the land and the spirits of place was so thrilling for me, because I've seen many tick box ones, hi, welcome to the meeting. We'd like to start by acknowledging that we are conducting this meeting on the lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. First on our agenda, it's just really, it's pretty perfunctory. So thank you for making that distinction between the acknowledgement and the welcome. The welcome is like somebody from that territory who has, you're not just asking anyone, you're usually, you found somebody who is able to carry a welcome to others. And
for me, part of the beauty is like, even now, whoever's listening to this will be wondering, well, whose historically land am I living upon? Even that is a door opener for many people. Today I had a call from a woman who's in the fashion industry in New York City. And she was saying, she said, I've learned so much over the last couple months, and we have these teepees that we have as part of our show, and I'm figuring out what to do with them and how to use them or not to use them, if we can have some way to talk about the appropriation of them, and how do I do an acknowledgement? So I'm thinking, imagine at like a fashion show in New York City that there will be an acknowledgement of the land. And I know one day, I think it will be Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac, but I know one day I'll be at a concert and there will be that acknowledgement of the territory. That we're moving there. That the humility of individuals honoring those whose land we're gathered on will move us to that place. And to me, that's exciting.
Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
This past weekend, I was teaching the first class of the newest cohort of the Numinous School. So, this year there's 100 people from around the world.
Amazing.
There was, I think, we topped out at 40-something live, which is quite a lot. And Tiffany provided a territorial acknowledgement on that call. And I said, the reason we're doing this, even though this is virtual, is a couple of things. I, as the person convening and gathering, I am here in connection because I'm supported by the ancestors of the land that I live on. And it's by the grace of the spirits of place that we are able to connect with the beyond. And they're supporting us in the unseen, and the least we can do is get friendly with our neighbors in the unseen realms and say like, oh, there were people who lived and birthed and suffered losses and parenting joys and marriages. Like he said, all of these things have happened since time immemorial on these lands. And if you think that there aren't ancestors and spirits of place supporting your spiritual practice, like you let me inform you that there are. So I wanted to talk about this specifically in the context of people like myself who might be working online, doing spiritual work or healing work. Maybe they host retreats. Maybe they produce events like a fashion show, or they're having kids camp. It could be for youth. It could be they lead board meetings. Whatever it is, you're a person who's convening gatherings, and you're going to do some kind of work that you hope is going to be supported, is going to create connection. Let's say you want to start acknowledging the ancestors of place and the territories, the traditional territories, the peoples whose land you're on. Who is the best person to offer a territorial acknowledgement? And let's kind of rank it a little bit in terms of like, who would be the best person to do that for you? Let's say you're hosting a yoga conference. You know, our friend Carolyn has done this, right? Had to figure out depending on where I'm hosting it, who do I ask? And under what circumstances then would you like modify, adapt, and like would other people be okay? Is it okay to do territorial acknowledgement? And is there any time or any kind of person or situation or role where it's not okay to do it?
That's a lot of questions.
I know. It's like, let's just figure out everything, Monique. It's complicated, and I want to know the right way because I come from the Western psyche that's like, give me a checklist. But let's muddle through.
All right. So I would say, and this is only my perspective, right? Like, even already we've had where my teachers have said Wasanic and you've said Wasanich. And I've heard Tiffany say Wasanich. So there's already, it's important to keep in mind that the pan-Indianism is not something I want to be a proponent of. So all I'm sharing is my knowledge and what I know. If you ask somebody else, they may have another perspective. And whoever's listening might say, well, somebody else told me this. So I think when we talk about spirit, people have to listen to their intuition also and say, does this land for me or not? And if not, then how do I keep doing my research? So when I think about it, because I do a lot of work in early years in education, when we look then to say, who can we have to come? And it is an acknowledgement, but I see it as when that person comes, they lay down the blanket of medicine for us then to step onto to be transformed in whatever we're participating in. So it's sort of not like, okay, well, you can just invite so-and-so. It's like, who comes, who will understand? It's like, I might not want to invite somebody who knows nothing about yoga or that practice or why we're gathering or what is it that calls our spirits to gather around yoga if they know nothing at all about yoga. So there's kind of two things. There's one about who in community is deemed within that community as able to do acknowledgements, and then who within that has the understanding of why we're coming together, why we've been called together, that can lay down that medicine for us, that blanket. I'm using all these as metaphors, right? Lay down that blanket of medicine for us then to step onto to be transformed. Because when we come together, that's usually what we're seeking, right? And that may not be our conscious thinking, but it's often why we're called is, okay, well, how will this dialogue, even our dialogue before the microphone came on, has transformed me? Or how do we, when a group of us come together, the transformation is profound. And it usually isn't visible. Sometimes it is, but it's usually more internal and intrinsic and may not even be felt immediately. So, for example, I was just in Nanaimo yesterday, and there was 2 elders who opened Auntie Florence, and she is from the nation, from Nanaimo, and she laid down this beautiful, one of the things she said was that I hope that there's so much joy for all of you over these 5 days that you leave not only with your hearts full, but all of your pockets and your suitcases full of joy. How do you not have a beautiful gathering when somebody starts like that, right?
Yeah.
And then Uncle Shane Point, who's both from Nanaimo and Musqueam, he sang a welcome song for people. So in those 2 ways of welcoming, and there was people there from across this country we call Canada. How do you not feel then rooted in a way to be present and be accountable and responsible, as you said so beautifully, to those ancestors who are present? It means then how I show up for these 5 days will be different. right? My actions, and whether we're conscious of that or not.
For sure. So one of the things I've learned a couple of things about this process in terms of approach, and I don't want to kind of get the cart ahead of the horse or anything here, but I do want to just kind of seed for people that there's in terms of like who can do it. It does take some effort to find out who within that community has been deemed by that community that can do that acknowledgement. And then, even then, you might have to follow up a few times. They may or may not be able to do it. And like you said, the chemistry may or may not be there. I know when I go up to Pachita territory and Bill Jones comes and does an acknowledgement, I'm usually leading some kind of like witchy type retreat, and he's like not. He's like, we went to the Shaker Church because we had to, because we were Indians taken to school. That's how he would say it. But I knew Bill's. Now deceased, but his older brother, when he was the first man to tell me about residential school, and I didn't believe him when I was 21, and we discovered we had this connection. And so there's a lot of potential for personal and collective healing. It's like energy work for the collective when you just kind of keep at it, right? And really make sure that you're trying to get genuine connection. It was different when I go up to Shuswap area where I lead the wilderness quests, and I had to write so many letters and talk to so many people on the phone, and ask so many people, well, do you know anyone? So many dead ends before I found wonderful Elder Norman Rataskett. Explained to him what I was doing. It's like, I'm trying to lead wilderness quests, but in a non-appropriative way. This is what I've stripped out. This is what I'm keeping in. I don't know. What do you think? And he was like, oh, I get what you're doing. Oh, I like what you're doing. Oh, I understand. I've never been able to do what you're doing, but I'm going to go and help you. And so he's come out each time, and it's a very profound experience to work and work and work until you finally find someone that, you got a good chemistry with. So it's not just checking the boxes again. It's not always going to be the first person that feels great, right?
Yeah. And I think, when people are planning, that acknowledgement is part of the list of to do, but it needs to be the initial part, because when we're planning any gathering, or even of two people that we know has the potential for transformation, the ceremony of that gathering begins when we begin the first planning of it,
right,
or the first speaking of it, right? The first speaking of that future. And within that then means that finding that person needs to be one of the very first endeavors. Because just as you said so beautifully, it took a long time. And if you had left it to the week before the quest began, you wouldn't have had that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes what people think is like, oh, well, I'll just call the band office and they'll send me somebody.
Yeah, they've got somebody just on call. They come out like, like a paramedic or something that you just call. They're just waiting. No, it's not like that. Yeah, very, very good point. And I might even back up, and I think I can say this pretty confidently because I've experienced it several times. Again, as like white settler kind of doing a number of public events where you're gathering and you have this great intention. Okay, I really want to honor reconciliation, or I want to honor diversity, whatever is kind of bringing you to this orientation of like a territorial acknowledgement is important to me. The first thing is that truth bomb's going to drop on the boardroom table, and your collaborators are going to go, oh, that sounds nice. Like, some are going to be cool with it, and some are going to be like, oh, well, if that works, okay. And sometimes there's like a bit of pushback, right? It's like, oh, well, we haven't put an honorarium in the budget. It's like, well, then should we be doing this event if we can't toss 100, and that gets super tense sometimes. And so we have to build in, I think, the time and emotional resiliency as well to make sure that everybody's really clear on like what it is and why it's so important and what it means then to do it in a good way. Because just kind of be ready for that too. That's always takes me off guard, and it happens frequently.
It happens. I had a friend a couple of years ago ask for some guidance to do this, and I said, well, you need to have, an honorarium, and the person said, I don't think my board will go for that. And I said, well, then I'm not going to, if you're not going to give them an honorarium and a gift, then I'm not going to help you find this person, because that's not respectful.
Yeah.
And then there was an invitation then for me to come and do an opening, and I just declined, because I was like, when we begin to honor those whose wisdom and knowledge looks different than the Western wisdom and knowledge, that's when our world will shift and change. But we're not always there yet.
And you mentioned the word humility earlier, right? Oh my gosh, you don't realize how much we've internalized this kind of Western checklist, budgetary, does it fit in our model? And so it's like everybody else is doing this by volunteer, let's say. It's like, this is different. This is different. And so that humility, it does take some practice, right? And a lot of people, like I said, you might be calling a lot of times, you might not be getting the kind of quick response you want, and you've got an agenda. Well, guess what? This is about repair. And so, there's a lot of humility required. And so, I just want to kind of seed that for folks who might be a little surprised that their well-intentions don't roll forward as quickly as they hope. Now, is it ever okay for non-Indigenous folks to perform a territorial acknowledgement? I'm just going to leave that.
I think an acknowledgement for sure, because you can say, right, I think in some ways it's just like me. Sure, I am a Nihio woman, a Cree woman, but I'm a visitor on this territory. So I don't actually think that's any different than you as a Scottish woman, as a visitor on this territory. Because this isn't the land that my ancestors come from. This isn't the land that has fed my blood and my being, although it has for 23 years since I've lived here.
Right.
But a welcome, no, I don't think so. That's the difference.
So how then, if you are a settler on land, but you want to acknowledge the land, what are some suggestions for how to do that in a good way, especially for those listeners who are from an area where they've never seen this before? Maybe you could just say something of here's some talking points I might hit.
Yeah. Well, one, acknowledging whose nation it is, offering thanksgiving for being a visitor or a guest, whichever term, even if they've lived there all their lives, their ancestors do not come from this place of land. And then what does it mean to them to live there, to work there, to raise their family there? And this is, I think, a place of humility and reflection. It's like, oh, I've never actually thought about how is my life blessed living here compared to if I was living, I don't know, even in Manitoba. It would be different, right? Our worldview would be slightly impacted, and it is impacted wherever we live. And so what are we grateful for about where we live?
Okay, so let's say you or your organization have decided, yes, this is very important to us. We're placing a high value on being in alignment with our integrity here. We want to do a territorial acknowledgement, and we want to approach the nation. We've Googled and we've figured out which nation this land traditionally was stewarded by. And what do we do?
I think there's lots of things you can do. One, you can put a call out to your friends and relatives and say, do you know anybody who is from this nation? And that can be kind of a relationship way of being introduced. And the other way is to simply call the nation, the band office, or the health center, or the education department, or the social programming, and just be upfront. I am looking for somebody to help me do a territorial welcome, and I'm really looking for your guidance as to who might be the best person to do that. And I have an honorarium, I have a gift, and any guidance you have for me around how to do this in the best way possible, I'd really appreciate.
Fantastic. You also gave an excellent piece of advice that I've remembered for years, that if you're a bit nervous about saying the name of the band, or if you're seeing it and it's written in a different script than you're used to. What was your tip? Do you remember?
Oh, yes. I think I said to call the band office and just keep listening to the recording.
Like after hours.
After hours, so you could hear what the intonations were of the language as they described their nation or the health center or whoever it is you're calling, to call after hours and keep listening.
Usually their answering machine will say some kind of greeting, and they'll usually say the name of their nation or their band, and I have done that so many times when I'm like, I don't know how to say Sequapunk, that kind of thing, and so I'm like, I'm reading it and I can't do it. I just call after 7:00 p.m. I call a lot of times and leave no messages. So after you've done that, there's probably some protocols. There's and like people could learn the hard way, but maybe we could just give them some inside information about, like, generally speaking, we know it's going to be different everywhere. There's going to be local customs, but generally speaking, let's say you've got a name and they're like, oh, this is the person. There's probably some good questions you should ask, or some like things you need to know in order to figure out how to approach that elder in a good way. What would you suggest?
So let's say, for example, you and I are having the call on the phone, and you're the person at the health center, for example, and you've said to me, you need to talk to Betty. And so I could say to you then, all right, could you help me know what would be the best way to approach Betty? I have some canned salmon, I have some tobacco, I have gifts that I'd love to bring to her, but I also know that some elders like to be contacted by text, some elders like to be phoned, and some like to be visited in person. Could you help me understand the best way to connect with Betty? And just keep kind of asking that person to help you to understand. And then you know then how to best approach Betty. And the other piece then is that I would go then and take a gift to whoever it was who just helped me so much, right? So I'd come and say, thank you and I could bring something that I could, like your beautiful bouquets of flowers. I could bring something I've canned. I could bring a movie voucher. Like you could do all kinds of things.
You know what I always bring?
What?
Books by Monique Gary Smith. I bring every book that you have and say, if you know some young people, here's some board books, or you could put them in your early childhood education center, and, this book could go to a classroom, or you could share it amongst the staff, or it's for you, whatever you like. And whoever it is, I might put other stuff in. For Elder Norman, I usually bring him some like homemade barbecue sauce and some quince jam for Bill Jones, and just things like that. And sometimes I've bought like something from this land, like going to the Aboriginal Cultural Festival. I'm always looking for like, oh, is there a toque that I think Bill would like, or something that I could support the arts and crafts of the local nation and gift it elsewhere. So it's like kind of harkening back to trade and that kind of thing, gifting. I have also discovered when I was trying to court and woo a chief, and specifically his wife, actually, to come and provide a welcome at a large event for youth. And so I don't have a car, so I had to like rent a co-op car, go across town, show up with my gift. And the chief opened the door. I said, oh, see, I'm like, thank you so much. I'm sorry to like burst in on you. I was actually seeking your wife, Oh, she's not here, but if you come back tomorrow morning. I was like, oh, sure. What time would be good? Oh, 10 o'clock. If you don't get here by 10 o'clock, she's going to get scooped up. Oh, okay. Should I leave the present? Oh, yeah. So I left the gift so that I come back the next day, but I didn't want to be empty-handed, so I brought a little bit of jam. Got there at like 1:45 and was just getting my stuff from the car, and somebody knocked on my window of the car in the driveway. Oh, are you looking for, Mrs. And oh, yeah, I am. Oh, she just walked down the street with my cousin about half an hour ago. I'm like, oh, okay, well, here's my present, and like, maybe I'll try to call. And they were like, probably don't do that. I was like, okay, I'll be back tomorrow. So they're definitely you kind of have to feel into what are the norms with this family and this way of being. With this family, it was okay for me to cold call as long as I was willing to do it half a dozen times and like bring something every time, because it was like, and I said, oh, well, maybe should I call or email? He was like, well, how would she know how much you want to see her then? It's like, oh, there was humility in action. Good lesson.
It's interesting because a few years ago when we were launching My Heart Fills with Happiness, I wanted Elder Shane Point, who I spoke about earlier, to come and do that welcome for Julie Flett and I. And I had met him many times, and I knew he lived in Vancouver, and I wasn't going to be over any time period. So I said to my friend Joan, do you think I could call him? She's like, oh yeah, leave a message. And so I called a few times, I never heard from him. She said, email him. I emailed him a few times, I never heard from him. I was in Vancouver, I stopped by his house, he wasn't home. And then I'm like, Joan, like, we're like 6 weeks out and I need to do something. She's like, text him. I texted him and right away the bubble started to come up.
Oh.
He's like, I'd love to.
Yeah.
And so then I talked to him later and I said, I phoned you. And he said, I don't pay attention to any of that. Just text me.
Yeah, it's so true. It's different with everyone. I'm the same with Tiffany. I just text her, hey, are you going to be around Sunday at 10? Kind of thing. Like, okay, happy to. And I think even what I have noticed is it's very much appreciated, even if you're not organizing something. But if you're a person who's a spiritual seeker and you're traveling somewhere, I went down to Death Valley and did quest work down there. And I've done it a couple of times. And the first time I just didn't have this awareness. I was so grateful to the land and the spiritual connection I had there. But I didn't know, it was like 2007. It was very kind of early in this self-education and cultural wave that we're catching of just greater awareness about settler colonialism. And so the last time I went down was a few years ago, and I called ahead. I Googled looked at the map, like whose traditional territories is the spot where I'm questing on. Oh, it's the Timbisha-Shoshone. I'm going to call the interpretive center, tell them what I'm doing. Hey, I'm coming down. I just wanted to know, since I'm going to do some work on the land, spiritual work on the land, how could I go there and be there in a good, respectful way? And they were like, well, I'm just so thrilled you're asking. Thank you. And so like, this is wonderful. And had I not done that, I would have made a lot of mistakes that I didn't know. I didn't know that the creosote bush was a sacred plant. I didn't know that mesquite was too precious. And actually it's protected. You're not allowed to pick it up or burn it. Like, there were all these things that I was so grateful to know. It feels good to be a good guest. And so then when I went down, I took some copies of My Heart Fills with Happiness and Tilly and I wrapped them all up, and I knew it was going to be a Sunday, but this woman at the interpretive center had said, have you ever had Indian tacos? Carmen, you should come down for Indian tacos. And it was like 50 miles out of my way, totally not on the route to get to Vegas, but it just felt so good that they'd worked so hard to connect me with like the right person, and she was so pleasant and lovely in how much education she provided that I wanted to give them this little gift. So I wasn't able to get tacos because everything was closed, but I just brought a dry bag with me and I put the gifts in it and I put them on the door of the closed tribal office and had a little card in it, and just like, thank you so much. So they got a little surprise, that next day. And it was fun. It was a wonderful experience to be able to feel like I was going to surprise somebody with a little gift.
Yes.
So, and but I wouldn't have known that if you hadn't taught me, if I hadn't had you to call. So thank you for sharing this with the wider world too.
I just want to quickly share one of the greatest gifts that I've received was from Elder Ganawaka. Her English name is Diane Longboat. And she said to me once, she said, we always get given blankets when we're done. She goes, but I have a closet full of blankets. She said, I'm always really touched when somebody thinks about what else might Diane like. So one year she was doing some work for Roots of Empathy, and I got her this was when they had just come out, sunglasses with the Korean hunt design on the arms. And when they were gifted to her, she started to cry. Because she's like, it's not a blanket. And two, like, you really thought about me when you chose this. And that's what the gifting is about, right? It's just like you said when you went to the tribal office, it's knowing that my generosity of spirit will alter their day in some way. And we can still give blankets for sure, but then one more little added piece. Even, I know you love raspberries, so here's some raspberry jam, right? Even that small little addition alters the generosity.
And with a nice card, thank you so much, like a really, really good card. Love doing that, finding a nice one that maybe evokes the land or something like that. And let's talk dirt here. Honorariums. So difficult. No, nobody's ever going to tell you kind of a rate, right? Like, this is like a very
I think it's
thing.
Usually $200 to $250 plus gas.
Okay. Is that if you're an individual or an organization? Because now I feel like a cheapskate. I usually do $100 if it's like a local kind of thing, plus my gift.
Yep.
Sometimes I gift them something else too, like, you're coming to my workshop and you want to come to my workshop.
Yeah.
So obviously you're coming for free, and I'll pay for your lunch, and I'll do all that.
And all that is bigger than the $200 then, right?
Right. Okay, so when I'm out at Quest and Elder Norman is coming from far away, I'm adding gas. It's a significantly greater honorarium than what you're stating. But I also am like, and if there's anything you want to sell, if you'd like to bring your artwork or your drums or whatever, like, an invitation, if it's possible and appropriate to, because often what I have felt is I'm so grateful when I hear that acknowledgement. It's touched me so much. The sort of, clinically, you could call it the somatic charge is so healing that I'm like, what can I give you? I would like to buy your print or your knitting or your drum making or, that sort of thing. So I think that's also really appropriate, is if this person has other things or skills, that they're not going to say, hey, can I, bring my carving? If you know that about them, I think it's really nice if you can offer it, because as an audience member, I often want to do that.
Yes.
I want an opportunity to say thank you again and have a connection piece. Does that seem appropriate to you?
It totally does. And I think your point is really valuable, that when he comes, he's more there than 5 or 10 minutes, right? So that's the other pieces. And I think, sometimes if we think historically that many of these who are coming, even Tiffany, who chronologically is young, her wisdom is not young.
No, she's considered an elder by her peer, like her family. Yeah,
for sure. And there's a young woman also from Esquimalt, from the Dick family, who also comes. Yes.
Brianna Dick. Yeah.
And so it's thinking about, if we were to ask a doctor to come, what would their honorarium be? Even if they were only speaking for 15, 20 minutes. Right? Like, I've seen some places, I've been at some conferences where the speaker is $10,000 to $20,000. Oh, God. And then there's a reaction to a $200 honorarium, and it's like, okay, we have to, totally.
Yeah, that's some. I don't like to throw this word around very much, because I think it specifically means repatriation of land and rights, but that's some decolonization work to do right there. If you've just paid a speaker, or you've paid travel or hotel for someone, and you don't want to give a $100 honorarium to somebody because you're like, but they're only up there for 10 minutes. It's like, oh my God, you have to lay that down right now. Like, humility.
Yeah, and also, because I think that, like, if I was to come and ask you to do a welcome, once that exchange has happened, you're beginning to think from that moment on, what might be the words that I might want to share to this unique gathering of people. So it isn't that they just arrive and then spout off a single. There's always medicine that's laid down, and that's, in this currency, that's worth financial dollars.
For sure. And I think that's worth also highlighting to people that you don't get to say what you want your territorial acknowledgement to be like. So if your elder starts sharing about, I shouldn't say your elder, I'm like, they're mine, I love them. If your guest who is an elder starts talking about their experience in residential school. And you notice like people starting to brace themselves or whatever, you just soften your face, feel your feet, feel your seat, and like co-regulate your crowd, because this is part of the medicine. This is what we're doing here, is repair work. And so giving some time and space for that is so important. And I have definitely, be prepared for this. I've definitely had the experience of an elder who's doing a territorial acknowledgement, whose personal spirituality is religious. They've gone to residential school, they've gone to the Shaker Church, they've, and so they are offering a blessing that sounds, and like I've gotten emails from, guests and ticket holders who are like, I didn't like the religious talk in the beginning. And all we can do is respond with like, we don't control, like we're here in a spirit of connection and respect. And, we hope that everybody has a beautiful experience witnessing somebody else's spirituality and the love and the way they're trying to express that to us. We take no position, other than, sorry you didn't expect that, but that's what it is. We don't dictate what our guests are going to say when they come up. And I think that's really important to recognize that, we're trying to restore agency and sovereignty to people who have been, up till right now, have been living in a system that tries to strip of dignity at every turn. And so when you are doing this work of starting to include reconciliation work in an acknowledgement, we have to acknowledge that sometimes it's really painful and really awkward, but it can be so beautiful. So I'm just seeding that, because I've had a number of times where 300 people are kind of looking at me after I get the mic back, because they're like, what was that? And I'm like, we have to then be ready, I think, to step into thank you. Thank you for blessing us. Thank you for sharing your medicine with us. Thank you for being here, that kind of thing. And then what should people know about how to treat our guests well if you are, say, doing a public event, and so now you have an elder that has agreed to come? How else can we make sure that they feel well taken care of?
And it may be an elder. It's interesting. I keep coming back to Shane Point, because he was saying to me a few months ago, he said, I don't like being called an elder. He said, I like to be called a cultural knowledge holder. He said, because there are a lot of elders who are not in a good place.
Right.
And any elder can come and do anything, he said, but a cultural knowledge holder will know a good way to do things. And that has really and because also, like you said, Tiffany, right, as a chronologically aged young person, has that wisdom as a knowledge holder.
For sure.
And has been gifted the ability to then share it. What was your question?
Well, so we have a knowledge
how do we
keeper
care for them?
or an elder, and I would think that it's the same kinds of practices, but how do we be good hosts? How do we do this differently?
I always think that, especially if we're hosting a gathering, that we have one person who's assigned to take care of them. And so if I've invited you, then I would be that person that would welcome you initially and say, and my friend Carolyn here is going to take care of you for the rest of the time while you're here. And if it's in a large auditorium, make sure that they're seated, the most easiest access to get on the stage if they need to get on the stage. Make sure mobility issues are taken care of. Make sure they have water, see if they're hungry.
The way I have thought of it is, so when I've done the larger public events, I always want someone who also understands why we're doing a territorial acknowledgement to be that sort of like a personal assistant. So it's like, this is my husband, Ruben. He's going to be your concierge. If you need anything, he's there. And then Ruben knows you're going to anticipate and multitask. So you're going to anticipate like, oh, look, their water's halfway, so I'm going to just go ahead and get another full one. Or, oh, look, and so then that special guest is treated like a guest of honor the whole time. And so, when I'm hosting retreats, we invite them to stay for dinner.
Yeah.
Everybody gets a chance to chat. We're not just kind of moving right into agenda. Or if that's needed, we're moving into agenda, then we pause to say thank you very much to that special guest and make sure that if I then have to be on stage, someone else is walking them to their car, making sure that their ride is there. Offering a ride is another thing, like if it is an older person, maybe they need a driver, maybe they need a lift, that kind of thing. So these are all of the little tools and tricks that I've like picked up along the way.
And then the afterwards, that within a week, the follow-up, either a phone call or a letter in the mail, or if that person is a texter and that's how you've communicated a text, a simple thank you once more. It's like, how many times do we ensure that they've felt seen? Right? That's the piece, I think, that's how we hold them up with dignity and respect. And then what's happened is your relationship is solid. So the next time that you're in need of a knowledge holder to come, they're like, oh, I'd love to come, Carmen. Right? Because they had such a beautiful experience last time. They're like, of course, I'll be there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because they know that however they get there, then they're there and they're taken care of and they're nurtured and they get a little letter in the mail. Like, all of that.
Exactly. It's a really special thing. It's like, it's like, how can I delight this person?
Exactly.
It really is a courtship in a way.
It is.
Yeah, it's a special thing. What do you hope the custom of territorial acknowledgements will accomplish in the long term? Like in our region, in our country, in the world?
My hope is that it allows people to pause and reflect on the beauty of where they live, and that they remember that there have been people there since time immemorial that may or may not have included their lineage. And, I used to have this beautiful office over here on the bay, and about 7 years ago, there was a house being built out on the point, and the architect came and was meandering about and being there. And then he took his lunch and he was sitting down on the rocks having his lunch, and he leaned back with his arms, you know how you lean back against your arms to enjoy the sun and the breeze. And his arm kind of went into a little something. So he just kind of began to explore and open and dig in there. And what he unearthed was an old clam gathering bowl that was 7,000 years old when they took it to the RBCM, the Royal BC Museum. And you think about how many times has the tide come up and gone down. And it's those little discoveries that always makes me realize, like, yeah, I am but a fraction of time on this land, that there have been generations before me and there will be generations behind me. And so how do I honor this land in the best way now? And I think that's part of what these acknowledgements and the honoring are allowing. As well, it's allowing people in this country where we live, Canada, to reframe and say, oh, yeah, right. I do, even though I'm 5 generations or 6 generations settler, my family actually, their blood and their bones did not come from this land. These were not the stars that they initially were born under and grew up under. And that allows us then to have a bit of humility. And I think then holds up some reverence for those whose traditional land we actually are living and breathing and collaborating and having children on. And
So being very real now, I will admit that I'm still a fragile white woman. Whenever I hear territorial acknowledgements, I pretty much cry. I feel, I'm even now thinking of different, lovely, beautiful grown men who've told me about their experiences as children in residential school. It really pains me. And like reconciliation work, it's like, it will really tap some deep places if you let it go there. And lots of times you don't want it to go there. And it does, because being in the presence of survivors and the children of survivors is so powerful. But even though it feels important, and even though I feel it's connective work and all of that, there's a part of me that always is like, oh, this is gonna break my heart. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, you know, you've been on the show a few times, and I've asked you about grief and rage before. And that was a while ago, and we were earlier on in the reconciliation project, and maybe we were a little naive, or maybe we were like optimistic, I don't know, overly optimistic. I'm still optimistic about it, but so I want to ask you that question again. How do you cope with the big emotions like grief and rage when you put that in the context of reconciliation?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, when we talk about reconciliation, we always have to include truth, because that's why we're here having these discussions around reconciliation. And the legacy of residential schools was the truth that catapulted reconciliation, but it's not the only legislation in our country that has and continues to impact the wellness of Indigenous children and families, but also significantly impact the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. And that truth is what a lot of people are having a hard time grappling with, that there is so much horror in that truth. And, you know, this country has been somewhat okay to say cultural genocide, but the reality is it was genocide. Mm-hmm. And many legislations were genocidal. And so for me, when I understand that truth, it does create a rage within me, without question. And that's when I have to go outside. I have to be out on the land. That's for me where my rage can come out, because I can put it into the water, I can put it into the trees, I can put it into the ferns growing, because if I keep it inside, it's going to come out towards my children. Mm-hmm. And then it's going to come out towards their children. And then in my mind, the legislation has won. Mm-hmm. And I do not want the legislation to win. Mm-hmm. That legislation has impacted my family in ways that for sure have been culturally genocidal in my family. And yet here I am still. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of why I choose to write and speak about hope and joy and resilience and to be consciously focusing on what fills my heart with happiness. Because if I always focused on my grandfather and my mom's, those two lives, and how those two lives have impacted my life and the lives of my two uncles, I don't know if I'd still be alive, Carmen. Mm-hmm. I definitely wouldn't be sober anymore. Yeah. So and I'll use we, but for me, I make choices about the thoughts that I allow into my head and into my heart. And then I make choices about how, when those thoughts are grief-stricken, where do I go to release them? Mm-hmm. And it's why sometimes I say no to some work, because I'm like, I know that community could benefit, but I don't know if I could rebound from being in that community yet. Right. Somebody else has to go to that work. It's not my time. Mm-hmm. And I mean that, like, it's not my time to share what I have to share, and it's not my time yet to learn what I can learn from being in that community. Because I think wherever I go, it is a reciprocal. And mostly, to be really honest, I feel like I learn way more than what I share. And like you said, you know, when you went to Death Valley calling, whenever I land somewhere or travel somewhere, I always introduce myself, you know, to those. So when I was in Shanemo yesterday, to the ancestors, my name is Mistigwashkikos. I come from the Cardinal Nanape families, so that that there is a reciprocal relationship at the very beginning. And then I feel like it opens me to learn and to be present and to hear Auntie Florence's welcome yesterday in a different way than if I was just coming for a 3-hour speaking gig. Right? Like,
yeah. And how do you then continue to seek joy and hope? What are the things that help you fill up with that?
I'm very selective who's in my circle and the language they use. I choose what I read. I listen to a lot of podcasts that fill me, right? And not just my mind and my heart, but all of my cells. And I'm, again, I think I'm almost hypersensitive about what do I allow into my space, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. Because I can go down rabbit holes really quickly. And then I always know my sobriety is at risk. And when my sobriety is at risk, my life is at risk. There's no question for me that those two don't go hand in hand. And I have children, so my life can't be at risk. So I have to be very careful who and what I surround myself with. I think we all do. Right? And the language I use, my mom and my sister and I went to see Oprah a few years ago in Seattle, and I'll always cherish that memory. But one of the things Oprah said was, whenever we say I am, whatever follows that is sure to come and find us. And I think about that a lot. Like, how do I describe myself? Like, when I constantly say I'm tired, what am I feeding? Right? Instead of I'm waiting for my second wind. It's very different, right? To say I'm a survivor is true, but to say I'm resilient has a different energy to it. And so that's, I think, probably the key way, which is why I sometimes do not engage on Facebook or on Twitter with those pieces that for me are toxic. Even though my wife often says, why haven't you responded? Or why don't you call into the radio station? Or my kids say, why don't you do this? It's because I know the detriment for me to do that, and then how that will filter into other aspects of my life. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense to me. I really appreciate you coming on this podcast and sharing what you have. I know there's a cost, even though we have relationship and we've talked about these things, but it's an incredible gift for you to share the knowledge you have about how to be here in a good way, and share that with the rest of us who seek to know and bungle and muddle through, but we're doing the best we can. I really appreciate the patience and care and generosity of spirit you've extended. Thank you.
Well, I bungle and muddle my way through too, so it's part of the human existence. And anything for you, Carmen. You know that.
I love you, Monique.
I love you too.
As I said at the top of the show, Monique is a consultant and also a keynote speaker. If you or your organization would like to connect with Monique to learn more about resilience, increased cultural competencies, education, or if you need someone to hold the heart space of your event through facilitation or an MC role, connect with her at MoniqueGraysmith.com. MoniqueGraysmith. And Monique has a new novel out this fall that has already been highlighted by CBC as one of the fall's most anticipated new fiction releases. It's called Tilly and the Crazy Eights. It's the follow-up to her best-selling Canadian novel, Tilly, A Story of Hope and Resilience. In this second book in this series, Tilly and the Crazy Eights, go down. It's 8 elders, and they go down to the Gathering of Nations powwow in New Mexico. Monique has also written best-selling children's books, and I want to highlight one of them for middle-year readers that most Canadian adults need on their shelf too. It's called Speaking Our Truth, A Journey of Reconciliation. Through personal accounts of survivors, as well as youth of today, my son included, and Monique's own stories, a narrative is repaired and made more whole and weaves the possibility for a new relationship with our history in Canada and to our future. I hope you'll ring up your local bookseller or hop on Amazon now and enjoy more of Monique's work. If you'd like to join me and my husband Ruben at Hollyhock this fall, time is running out. The registration deadline is coming up quick. The retreat is called Ritual and Practice for the Urban Homestead, but we're jokingly calling it Apocalypse Camp because we're going to gather to process our climate anxiety and eco-grief through ritual, community, shared labor, and connection. We'll be learning some key coping skills, and you'll leave with renewed capacity and a more skillful approach that will not only help you stabilize personally, but also enrich the life of your home community. We hope you'll join us. Learn more about it at carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.